Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Peter LaVenia. I'm the co-chair of the Green Party of New York. I also am an assistant professor of political science at SUNY Oneonta. Today, I'd like to discuss the basics of eco-socialism. I'm going to talk a bit, and then if we have questions, I will open the floor, but this is me at my most professorial. So to talk about eco-socialism, it's really necessary to define the parameters, and to do that we have to talk about the planetary ecological emergency. We're often told about the dangers of catastrophic climate change, and indeed this is one important part of the ecological emergency. It's only one of the 9 planetary boundaries, though, identified by scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Center, within which, quote, humanity can continue to develop and thrive for centuries to come. So these are climate change, biosphere integrity, land system change, freshwater change, biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, stratospheric ozone depletion, and novel entities. You can go online. The Stockholm Resilience Center updates these pretty frequently, and they are pretty user-friendly. I recommend it. Of these, 6 of the 9 have been breached. Only atmospheric aerosol loading, ocean acidification, and stratospheric ozone depletion are still within safe boundaries, though ocean acidification is apparently close to being breached, and aerosol loading regionally exceeds the boundary. Only ozone depletion is lessened in the last few years. I remember as a child being told that we had to save the ozone layer. It's one of the few places where we can claim serious environmental victories over the last few decades. So these aren't idle problems. Atmospheric CO2 currently stands at about 422 parts per million, far above the 350 ppm line that's been identified for the less than 1.5 C temperature shift that we require to continue human civilization as we know it, and almost inconceivably higher than the pre-industrial levels of 280 ppm. Climate change brings with it massive disturbances in modern human life, including agricultural disruptions, biodiversity loss, inundated coastlines, and the possibility of triggering other more catastrophic tipping points. Even by the most optimistic estimates, the goals set by the Paris Climate Accords, assuming they're reached, would not be enough to save us, as they would still allow for 1.8 C of warming. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction in human history, with an extinction rate of up to 10,000 times higher than previous extinctions. There's a possibility we lose 30 to 50% of all species on the planet Earth by 2050. There's no one tipping point in terms of biodiversity, but it's affected by all the rest, and it in turn affects them. What we call novel entities permeate our biosphere. Plastics and microplastics are found nearly everywhere on the globe. Humans have breached the freshwater boundary, withdrawing enough from the ecosystem, primarily from agriculture, to disrupt carbon sequestration and biodiversity. The last 25 years have seen a 10% decrease in global tree cover, with 12% of global land devoted to crop production. The Amazon is now emitting more carbon dioxide than it can actively absorb, so it's actually a net negative on carbon dioxide. Biogeochemical flows, what we know as carbon and nitrogen cycles, phosphorus cycles, nutrient cycles have been massively disrupted. And then ocean acidification, if it is breached, would add further pressure on other boundaries, as oceans are a huge carbon sink, as we may know, and oceans absorb fully about 30% of globally emitted carbon. So, even more problematic is the possibility that these boundary breaches will cause what we call tipping cascades. If the Greenland ice sheet goes, it could cause a collapse of what we call the AMOC, which is a primary current in the Atlantic Ocean. And there are signs that this is weakening. If this occurs, there will be massive temperature changes in Europe, sea level rise in North America, and an increase in extreme weather. Loss of West Antarctic ice sheet would lead to freshening of oceans and slowing of currents, increasing climatic changes in temperate regions, forest die-off, and permafrost degradation. As I tell my students when I teach this class, I say there is a real risk we are heading toward a quote-unquote hothouse Earth scenario, where the long-term climate will stabilize for millennia at 4 to 5 C higher than pre-industrial temperatures. And this would likely lead to the complete collapse of human civilization and extinction of the human species. You can think about what 4 to 5 C permanent global temperatures above what we currently see would look like. Cutting carbon emissions can't prevent this scenario. We have to work on stabilizing the rest of the boundaries and bringing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere down. So some of what we're talking about is dealing with the boundaries and also mitigate the effects of industrial capitalism. We continue to creep closer to the scenario on a continual basis, and I say this not to depress you, but to impress upon you that time is short, we can't delay, and the current socio-political system under which we live, capitalism is the cause of it, we cannot find a solution within it. So, it is capitalism and its need for endlessly increasing amounts of profit accumulation that is the root cause of the planetary emergency, or at least this is what I'm going to argue today, and this is what eco-socialist theory argues. So eco-socialist theory is grounded in this understanding of our social reality. Frequently we hear the term anthropocene used to determine a world fundamentally changed by humans for the worse. The scholar Jason W. Moore has posited that we should truly call this era the capitalocene, because it is the social relations of capitalism that are the root cause. I like this formulation. I like when leftists use formulations that get to the point but are also very descriptive and fun. So capitalocene it is for me anyway. This ecological change dates back to the beginnings of capitalism with the brutal colonization of the Americas and Africa in the late 15th century, a time span of 500 years. It was then that land and wealth were exploited on a mass scale for profit never before seen in human history, and is why the Industrial Revolution begat what we call the Great Acceleration, the rapid increase in human consumption of resources and impact on the planet. It's also the case that merely 70 companies are responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions since the 19th century. Capitalism is, as we will see, causing the problem. You know, we're often told that we can save the planet. I remember when I was a kid, I watched Captain Planet, and we were told to recycle and choose the right products. This is, it's not a bad thing, but mostly a lie, right? I mean, it's the system itself and just a few companies that are really causing most of the problems of environmental degradation. So, we get to the nut of it. I'm going to talk about Marx. Karl Marx wrote that, quote, "The wealth of societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities." This is the famous first line of Das Kapital. Commodity production is structured around what he called exchange value, which is the expression of the average amount of socially necessary labor time workers use to produce that commodity. So basically, exchange value is kind of the general amount of human labor put into something. Commodities also have a use value, which is the utility a commodity has to a person's society more generally. This will be important to talk about what is to come, or what could come with eco-socialism. The value of a commodity is the socially necessarily human labor power put into it, essentially expressed with the price of what's being sold. Capitalists only care about something's utility as long as it can make them a profit through that exchange value. Capitalists also own the means of production. Factories and businesses is private property. And they employ workers, what we call the working class or the proletariat, who don't own any part of the economy or even their own tools, to work for wages and produce that stuff in the form of commodities. So workers are first to produce that stuff beyond what they're paid in wages, right? When you go and you work, I use this example, you work at a pizza place for $10 an hour, and you make 10 pies at $20 a piece, which is, I think, not unreasonable. You're making a lot more than your $80 salary, right? That's surplus value, that's exploitation. Produce it for free. So, Marx described this as a general law of capitalist accumulation, where capitalists are driven to continually grow and expand production to make stuff so they can reap a profit endlessly. That's how our society is structured. It's what it means to be profitable. Capitalists can't stop wasting increasing amounts of resources, because to do so would be to not make a profit, right? But you might say, what about efficiency? This is often the hope of people that put their faith in technology. In eco-socialist circles, we call them eco-modernists, right? People like Elon Musk or someone else who thinks we can just put a lot of solar panels down and build a lot of electric cars and we'll fix stuff, right? The problem with this is that increased technological efficiency in capitalism leads to increased resource consumption. And really this has been understood since Marx's day. Stanley Jevons, kind of the originator of what we call the Jevons paradox, saw that essentially that as we increase efficiency of technological production, we use more resources. When you have a car that uses less gas, you drive more because you don't have to worry about actually spending so much on gas, so you can use more, right? Capitalism, we use more, right? It's just seems to be the way that we do it once efficiency is increased. So capitalism dominates the globe. It's forced to do so to search for profits. Hence, environmental problems are problems of capitalism. So Marx and Engels both understood that this was a rapacious entity, capitalism, damaging the planet, workers, and indigenous civilizations in search of endless amounts of profit. Marx also understood it wasn't just human labor power that created value, but nature itself. Eco-socialist writers such as John Bellamy Foster and Kohai Saito, I recommend checking out their works if you haven't. John Bellamy Foster has a number of really seriously important works. Kohai Saito has become famous most recently with a bestseller about eco-socialist degrowth. It was on the bestseller list in Japan. Really fascinating stuff. That a book about Marxism and eco-socialism is a bestseller anywhere, but there you go. Definitely worth checking out. They've uncovered and restored this element of Marx's writings, which were often ignored by earlier socialist thinkers. Marx looked at the works of Justus von Liebig, a 19th century chemist, who had begun to describe the interaction between humans and nature, called it metabolism, right? Interaction between environmental groups in the environment. So Marx read him and wrote about the interaction of human society and nature as well, understanding that different societies have different types of metabolism. Feudalism does different things to the environment, pulls different things from it than capitalism, and what socialism will hopefully do. Liebig called capitalist farming robbery agriculture because it stole nutrients from the soil for profit, didn't replace them. It would take stuff and grow a lot of cash crops in an area, denude the soil of nutrients, and then you sell it far away. When we eat and consume those things, what should go back to the earth in terms of a balanced cycle does not, right? You have a lot of stuff that goes into the ground or the water or whatever outside of New York City or Los Angeles that otherwise would be going wherever those things are grown. And so there's a disequilibrium, right? For capitalism, we see is that the system is not just about exploitation of workers, but exploitation and domination of nature, right? That's one of the key insights of Marx, and also where eco-socialism really kind of expands upon that. So nature is simply a source of free resources, and wealth for capitalism is something separate from humanity. So for Marx, production for profit creates what he calls metabolic rift. Capitalism destroys the stability of natural processes like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles as resources are transported from rural areas of the periphery to the core, right? So from places like you get your fruits in the store, or vegetables, especially during the winter, from the global south, right? And they're transported to the north where we purchase those things. We're taking resources and wealth from the nature of somewhere else. So those accumulation of resources turn into commodities, stuff to be sold for a profit. And this ensures it can't really stop using those increasing amounts of faraway bits of nature. This is also part of what we call ecological imperialism, right? It means it's not just buying stuff from poor nations cheaply, right? Unequal exchange for expensive ones made here, right? We produce the technological stuff, they produce the cheap products, and then we exchange. That's also exploitation. But unequal material resource flows. We take a lot of stuff out of the ground in those areas, right? Material resources, and don't really put anything back in terms of equitability, right? So, stuff from poor areas and nations is extracted and sent away, resources and nutrients not returned to the soil and water. Capitalism creates a disequilibrium in nature, reproducing in a myriad of ways. Because it's only interested in profit, it doesn't care about a sustainable world.
Just slow down a bit.
Slow down, sorry. So, the utility, the wealth, the use value of nature is to be consumed. This is why the cost of something is never factored into price. Capitalism would simply be unprofitable if it did not steal land, labor, and resources, right? So eco-socialism asks the question, what would a sustainable, good life for all within planetary boundaries look like, right? I mean, this is the question. We accept Marx's diagnosis of the problem, but then really ask ourselves, well, what would happen if we could have a sustainable society? The late Joel Cobell, again, a Green Party member, eco-socialist thinker, one-time candidate for office. Also, he taught at Bard College, not too far from here in was an early eco-socialist thinker and talked about what it would mean to build a society based on communal use values or utility, right, rather than exchange value. It means eco-socialism understands that we must end the domination of exploitation of workers and nature, right? It means ending capitalism and building a democratically run society that reduces resource use to sustainable levels and restores the natural balance of the ecosystem. It requires us to see ourselves as part of nature rather than separate. Eco-socialism asks us to build a different kind of society that looks radically different from the one we live in. That is only achievable if we overthrow capitalism and replace it with an ecologically focused and sustainably constructed social order. Here I'm going to quote the late Andre Gores. Andre Gores might have been the first to call himself an eco-socialist. He's also the person who coined the term degrowth as part of the first generation in the 1970s to start thinking about these things. He wrote in Ecology is Politics. Radicals who refuse to examine the question of equality without growth merely demonstrate that, quote, socialism for them is nothing but the continuation of capitalism by other means, an extension of middle-class values, lifestyles, and social patterns. Some of the problem with talking about ecology and socialism is that quote-unquote actually existing socialisms or previous socialisms often ignored the ecological part of Marxist thinking. They were, to a certain extent, what we call productivist, right? They say we have to deal with scarcity and poverty, and we just have to produce a lot of stuff, right? And what eco-socialism really says is that, yes, we have to deal with inequality and poverty and environmental degradation, but it's not just about producing a lot of things, right? We understand as eco-socialists that we have to make and provide collective and social use values, right? They're not going to be the same as things that we make in capitalism, right? We're not looking to just produce a lot of electric cars and a lot of worker-owned and operated Twinkies, right? Because we're going to be talking about what it means to be a healthy and sustainable society. Provision of education, a clean environment, healthcare, a sustainable and healthy diet, working communities tied to social needs that do not quote-unquote grow in the same way as commodity production. We're talking about education, healthcare, right? Happiness. These are not the same thing as accumulating a lot of wealth or a lot of products, right? They can get better qualitatively, right? But it's not the same thing as producing a lot of stuff, and we don't need to, right? An eco-socialist society would not be oriented toward production of a continually expanding surplus in the same manner. And what is produced would have to be democratically decided by associated producers in workers and community councils. That's a pretty core part of eco-socialism, that this has to be democratic on a very decentralized and fundamental level. So, eco-socialists argue against that eco-modernist trend that we can just use technology to get our way out of things, that then we just convert to socialism and we can keep producing stuff the way that we have, right? That we can keep making more stuff. There's really no evidence that economic expansion can be what we call absolutely decoupled from material resource use and carbon emissions. Very often you'll see statistics that, Europe or the United States has relatively or absolutely produced less in terms of emissions than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago. The problem is we've simply shifted those things to other countries, right? So we've moved them to China or other low-wage countries where it's cheaper and where the pollution doesn't reach the imperialist West, at least not directly, right? There's no evidence that even in a socialist society we could get away, right, from increasing emissions and resource use just because we've gotten rid of capitalism. We have to figure out a way to reduce that kind of resource use and emissions, energy consumption, without impacting what we call the buen vivir, good life form, right? So there are real material limits that we run up against. Marx understood this in his discussion of the metabolic rift. It can't be superseded. So the idea of living equitably and well within planetary boundaries. Another important eco-socialist thinker, Georgios Kallis, recently wrote, "Indeed, sustainable degrowth is a trajectory of decline in resource and energy use, accompanied by an improvement in well-being, welfare, use values, etc. Nor can technology save us. The EROI on renewables does not permit the same energy-intensive use as fossil fuels. And this still does not address the question of planetary boundaries. Nor does it address the question of ecological imperialism. We're going to get our resources for so-called sustainable development core from the periphery. Even in eco-socialist Canada or the US, the continued energy use and material throughput growth at current levels would require ecological exploitation of the periphery. Most of the lithium we get from car batteries comes from somewhere else, the nickel and cobalt, right? We're taking them out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Bolivia. Just to assume that we're, as socialist United States would produce a lot of electric cars, has a whole host of problems, right? Instead, what an eco-socialist society would do is rebuild a different kind of world, right? Work would become useful, and what was produced would be decided democratically by the people, communities, and societies that produce it. The amount of time spent at work would decrease as the extra needed for profit would vanish. We could provide more of the important things: education, healthcare, healthy food, and livable communities. Communities would be built to be walkable, bikeable, and trains would become the primary mode of intercity transit. Cars would be limited for extremely rural communities and emergency vehicles, and airplane use would be extremely limited. The statistics are, for those of you who like to travel by plane, that if we were to have what we might call a sustainable airline industry, if that even makes any sense, because airplane emissions are way worse for the environment than car emissions. We need to cut airline travel to about 30% of what it is today, so like massively degrow it. And we don't seem to be getting any closer to solar airplanes, unfortunately. We would build durable products that could be easily shared and repaired. Ivan Illich called these convivial tools. You know, the difference between having a high-powered technical machine that you have to take somewhere to be repaired, or a bicycle, right, that you might actually be able to repair on your own or take to someone down the street, right? Things that we can share and use that improve our kind of quality of life. I liken this to e-bikes as well. You may or may not like e-bikes. I remember the first time I got an e-bike, I said I could, depending on where I live, see this as a commuting tool, right? That this actually, it's easy, it's still a bicycle, and everybody can learn how to use it, and it's useful, doesn't really pollute, compared to buying this gigantic car or even using mass transit, right? So, convivial tools. We don't need constantly new products, but ones that last, right? I mean, this is something that we on the left talk about often, the kind of the way the products wear out for capitalism. Why does that have to be the case? It doesn't. We know that we can build products that last and don't need to be replaced, right? If you're not looking at a profit, I think that we have the know-how and skill to do that for many things, and also things that we share, right? I mean, that's part of eco-socialism, is that we can build a society, housing, the way that we construct dwellings so that we have shared resources, right? We live in communities now where we assume we're going to have single-family homes and dwellings and apartment buildings where everybody's separated. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case either. Density should be spread out. We talk about urban planning instead of giant cities. Eco-socialists talk about small and medium-sized ones that have art and culture for all, right? Do we need one massive New York City? Or can we have eventually many smaller, vibrant hubs around the country and the world? I'm not saying we're going to forcibly relocate people from these cities, but maybe over time we encourage more sustainable living environments, right? Reparations should be given to BIPOC communities, and housing should be built using sustainable materials. This is important, right? Production of things would be decentralized and localized as much as possible, because we're not looking for a profit, we're looking to make a sustainable world, right? And local is far more sustainable most of the time, right? Workplaces would become democratically run by the people who work in them, the producers. Rich countries, poor countries would help poorer nations economically and give climate reparations. Agriculture would shift from commodity cash crops to organic, healthy, and sustainable, and artificial fertilizer use, which is another major producer of greenhouse gas emissions, will cease. Getting there, of course, is the trick. So I'll end with this. Obviously, we need a revolution. How to get there? So here in the Green Party, we talk about the eco-socialist Green New Deal, and in all its variations, this is the beginning of a political platform. We need a political movement based around this eco-socialist society that builds on what that society might look like. We need political parties and organizations committed to making that change, right, where we have the discussion and conversation and build on ideas. There's no one dominant idea of what the world is going to look like, and I don't think there should be. This is the point of kind of a convivial society, right? What eco-socialists call the buen vivir, right, the good life. This talk, I hope, is a start of re-envisioning what the world looks like locally and globally. And for those of you here and watching, I hope you're ready to join us. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to take questions. So, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah.
If you want to. Can ask, or
Okay.
we can,
I can
stop the video.
No, I'll ask something.
Yeah.
So taking that we're not in a revolutionary moment, though you could say in the next 25 years we have one, but you could have said that 25 years ago and you'd be wrong. We're thinking more like a transitionary kind of movement, localist politics kind of way, like. And there are sort of regional, I guess this is not so much a question, but I'll get to one, I guess. There are regional and localist sort of policies that can get us towards more use value, community ownership, and things like that, even if it's a matter of co-op policy and other types of progressive Bernie-ish platforms that, and we can simply take it a little further by saying, and they're going to be permanent purpose trusts, or they're going to be land trusts and not just a co-op or a different kind of social enterprise as is a bit popular, because there are these other, not just eco-modernists, but also these other types in the nonprofit sector that are, how do we navigate these sectors where people are doing good work, but they're not quite the same high level as you've been discussing, or they're at a level where they understand things and things make sense, because let's say in what you've been describing, maybe my question is, can you relate this to, say, the high inflation we've had and the way that the federal government has, lowered the rate of inflation, and sometimes there's some good job reports put out. How do we navigate that kind of news and the realities that people see on a more daily or like basic level, and this broader vision?
So let me just see if I can summarize what you're asking. How do we deal with groups that are doing work around one or some or multiple issues related to eco-socialism, degrowth, local control, sustainable work, even though it's not going to overthrow the system entirely, right?
Or it's integrated with the system as it is.
Or what?
Or it's integrated with the system.
Yeah. I think that's a good question, and it's a difficult one, but it is a necessary question, because it's the same one that we ask ourselves when we're talking about really broad systemic change at any level. There are a lot of people that we need to convince to get to the point of change, like revolution. But again, as you said, aren't there yet, but who will march with us on important issues, right? Like, I'm thinking like the idea of permaculture or, land back kind of movement things that may be very radical or not, or like even tool sharing workshops, right? I think all of those things are very important. I think that given where we are with the movement, we should encourage them at a local level. We should encourage understanding of them. Our role as political eco-socialists is to say yes and, right? I think that's the important thing, right? That we're not here to denigrate these attempts that people are making that do make impacts in the lives of communities and workers and indigenous people, right? That's not that's not helpful. I think that that creates a sectarian distrust. And so while we might have conversations and disagree, right, about the, look, I think dealing with GMOs is important. I have for most of the time that I've been an activist, but I've also tried to talk to people who are very anti-GMO and said it is important, but the real background of that is you have a couple agribusinesses that own the majority of those patents, and you have very large companies that control the majority of agriculture in this country and elsewhere. Yes, we should try to move away from GMOs and win victories on that, but until we deal with capitalism, the problem that we're facing is only going to continue to grow, right, in terms of cash crop agriculture and unhealthy food. So I think, if it's a satisfactory answer, not to be negative toward people that we're marching with, right, this united front, but to be that group that says we're trying to put all the threads together and build this movement, and we want you to join us, and it's the only way we're going to have a sustainable world. So
Follow up.
go back, and I think that to get out of your centric way of thinking of things, it's also about being able to go back to other ways of living, right? To say capitalism doesn't work, but we know that there are societies that have been more or less sustainable, right? Indigenous societies, other societies that are more or less sustainable. We can go in that direction, right? We can liberate ourselves. So there are certain things, and I think you're right. I don't think we're going to use social media to the extent that we're going to liberate ourselves. It's pretty clear. Everybody says, oh, these things are going to connect us, and they do, but they're surveillance tools, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't look around and say that the structures of capitalism aren't creating a possibility for change within, right? I think they are. The problem we have in 2024 is that we really don't have, there's no political movement or political culture that's developed in the United States anyway, in Europe, in these major industrialized countries, that is capable of motivating people in that direction. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist elsewhere, because I think that there are places, especially in peripheral nations, formerly post-colonial nations, where people are very cognizant of this. It's very, very, very apparent where
that's so inspiring to see it too.
And imperialism are, right? So, but it is here, right? And the problem is, if you look back at the early 20th century, where you had the Russian Revolution and some other attempted revolutions, right? You had a subculture there and political movements for decades that were building up people to understand this stuff. And today, this doesn't really exist in the US, right? And so I think, or anywhere. So I think that's the problem. The problem is, like, we're trying to get to the organizational point, but maybe the educational stuff has to lay the groundwork alongside that, right? If we don't have a significant amount of people who are consuming and talking about this media and talking to each other and participating together and talking about sustainability and talking about socialism and talking about change, there's not going to be a concept of it. There's not going to be even a feeling that we need to move toward it. And so I think that's the problem. I think that's what we're getting. We have
Learned helplessness,
yes,
and compartmentalization.
We have to build our own.
Yeah, we have to create a sense of a shared, I don't know, economy of minds, shared.
That becomes an actual
culture. You have to go and create a new culture.
That actually becomes an actual economy.
Yes.
On the other hand, I'm an employee of a SUNY system, and so I watch the board of directors, the board of trustees, and they seem to be on, the SUNY system seems to be on track with that whole 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2040 or 2050. And this is just on the level of carbon emissions. It doesn't, you mentioned, 9 different categories that, of course, even the best of our institutions are not even able to address, because they're able to, but let's say public sector and nonprofit sector are at the very least sort of able to plan and are on track to, cut slash reduce their resource use, energy use, and whatnot. How much of that is like that? So when I asked before, not on the video here, but I asked like how much of it's on, we're live. How much of a break is required? How much of a break is like there are certain institutions and sectors in our society which are like sort of like they're part of obviously the world capitalist system,
Yes.
but then they also have certain values that are in conflict with capitalist values.
So, I mean, look, the SUNY system is a state bureaucracy. It doesn't have the same profit motive as capitalist entities. Can it get to 80% reduction? I mean, it's not enough. Obviously, we need close to 100% reduction. And really, most scientists are saying by 2030, which is rapidly approaching 2050, is far beyond that date, which is why they always kick the can down the road. So there are entities that are probably more able than others to do that. There are certain industries that are going to be able to move towards that, right? The cement industry is globally important as a source of carbon emissions, and it seems nearly impossible to produce cement without producing carbon emissions, right? They're going to fight that tooth and nail. The auto industry, clearly, the airline industry. So, I mean, it just depends. Yeah, I think state bureaucracies could probably say, yeah, sure, we'll do it if you give us the resources, because what does SUNY have to really do to do that? I mean, change the kind of way it consumes electricity, maybe deal with food consumption and heating. It's different. They're not transporting things, they're not building things, they're not producing things. It's doable. It's not going to make a difference in terms of stopping the global problem, because that's far beyond SUNY. That doesn't mean that it should be done.
Right. Many of these progressive or progressing sectors are on the consumer. They're at the bottom of the life cycle, so to speak.
Like I said, if there's actually, the data's out there. If you Google it, right, or whatever, search it, to not use a proprietary term, but between 70 and 90 companies are responsible for we're talking about 75 to 90% of global carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution. They're out there. They're quantified, right? That's what's doing the polluting. Those are who's doing the polluting. Same thing with resource use. Same thing with transportation, agriculture, right? I mean, those are the entities that are driving climate change and constructing a society based around mass consumption, which is the problem, really. We're at the receiving end of it. Again, there are a lot of different issues that go into this. There's obviously inequality in consumption, there's inequality in production, but yeah, it's great that an institution like SUNY wants to move in that direction. It needs to move faster and more radically. But it's, even if SUNY were 100% working on renewables and zero carbon emissions and zero waste, right, it won't stop the problem. And so that, I think, is what we have to deal with. That these things feel good. They're not going to solve climate change or the planetary crisis. Not that we shouldn't push these entities to do those things, but we're going to have to organize, right? And the people of the US and the world are going to have to organize and deal with capitalism. SUNY, great, right? But for New York State, right? We obviously want that to change. Here in Albany, we were part of coalition dealing with a lot of these pollution issues and power production issues for the state capital. Same thing, right? Yes, go renewable, but we're going to have to deal with massive petrochemical companies and industrial companies that are really the source of this, and you can't really stop that until you stop capitalism. And I think not just that, because I want to say this, and I'll stop talking, but as I said earlier, you can have a so-called socialist economy or post-capitalist economy that doesn't focus on sustainability and continue to do what was done before. I mean, there are problematic things that happened in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union because those countries really weren't focused on sustainability the same way. So we have to build a society consciously that's not just about ending worker exploitation, but dealing with the issue of